Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro, and thanks for listening. This week, an election was held in Israel to choose the members of the Knesset, Israel's Congress. This was the fourth election within a period of 2 years. The reason for these recurring elections is not to prove that Israel is a very democratic nation, but rather to show the flaws in democracy. And as Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. The problem is that there are 120 seats in the Knesset, so for a government to govern and be stable, it must include the 61 members and preferably more to be more stable. The more seats in the government, the more stable it is. One of the problems is that the party that gets the most seats in the election generally doesn't get more than 35 or 40 seats. So it has to bring other parties into a coalition if it is to be able to govern. So the smaller parties make all kinds of demands in order to join the coalition. And after 3 elections, a stable coalition could not be formed. So we had another election this week. And the Likud party may be able to form a right-wing coalition majority. Only time will tell. So I don't want to talk about that. I chose to speak about other issues this week, such as the issue of religion and state, which is unique to Israel, which is a state that came into existence after a period of close to 2,000 years, during which the Jews were held together by their religion without a state. And now we have a state, and so there are big issues involved. And there's also a related issue of political power and sovereignty. So these are the things I want to touch on this week. And also, next week is Pesach, which is Passover, our holiday of liberation. It's more than 3,000 years old. So I want to extend my sincerest best wishes to the listeners on this holiday of freedom. Enjoy yourselves. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words about sovereignty and the fact that we are just a few days before Passover, the Jewish holiday of freedom. Sovereignty is defined as political power, and a sovereign state is one that has political power over a certain geographical area. That's what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is the ability of a government to act in its own interests within an area and to protect that area. And that is the essence of statehood. Extensions of jurisdiction, the application of authority, and institutions to assure the protection of its citizens, these are what defines sovereignty. You have an area in which you essentially control and you protect. And since Passover is the holiday of freedom and essentially the birth of Israeli sovereignty or Jewish sovereignty in the land of Eretz Israel of Palestine. So I want to say a few words about the modern version of this sovereignty. This sovereignty is a relatively modern concept and expresses national independence and the right and responsibility to rule. The Jews lost sovereignty more than 2,000 years ago in this part of the world, and we returned to it back in 1948. So the roots of sovereignty are really in the Bible and in Jewish thought and in Jewish history. More than 1,000 years ago, Rashi, an interpreter of the Bible and the Talmud, defined Jewish sovereignty here in the land of Israel. The realization of Jewish sovereignty, the right of the Jewish people to its own homeland, continues to be challenged in wars and by efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel. So it's important that we remind ourselves of Jewish sovereignty on the eve of Passover. Passover is when we left Egypt more than 3,000 years ago, and after 40 years achieved sovereignty in this land. No other nation, by the way, many conquerors have been there. According to the history books, there's something between 19 and 23 or 24 other nations have conquered this little bit of land. None has ever been sovereign here. Some have exercised control over it, even for long periods of times, like the Turks did for 400 years. But essentially, they never declared sovereignty here. In 1967, following the Six-Day War, Israel regained important pieces in the central part of the land, particularly west of the Jordan River. These areas are enshrined in history, and they're allotted to the Jewish people by international agreement, including the League of Nations, the British Mandate, the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Charter as the Jewish national homeland. This includes Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and now the Golan Heights. Embodied in our text, these areas form the crucible of Jewish history. When Jews returned to the places like Jerusalem, for example, in the 1967 war, they found a rubble of synagogues. It was left by the Jordanian army. And there are other areas that the Jews didn't control for 19 years, like the tombs of Rachel in Bethlehem and the tomb of Joseph near Nablus and Gush Etzron and Hebron, where Abraham the patriarch lived, and the area around beneath Mount Hermon and the Golan Heights. When we came back here, we did not come as invaders. We were reclaiming what rightfully belonged to us. Jewish communities established in those areas taken over after the 1967 war, these communities were built despite opposition from international and domestic anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist organizations with no basis for their opposition. I myself lived in one of those areas, a place called Karnei Shomron, since 1986. No Jews lived there before 1967, that is from 1948 to 1967, because of a state of war and anti-Jewish policies of the Arab governments who illegally occupied these areas. And these areas were lived in by Jews up until 1948, when they were taken over by different Arab nations. No Jews lived there before 1967 because of, as I said, a state of war. However, when Israel captured these areas back in 1967, they really begged the Arabs to take them back in return for peace, which the Arabs refused. Now, since 1967, when no Jews live in those areas like Judea and Samaria, and until today, there are now 500,000 Jews live in that area. It's called, it was designated by the Oslo Accords as Area C. So, and by the way, since the 67 war, the same amount of Jews live in new neighborhoods here in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now the largest city in Israel. There are no official statistics for the Arab populations of the Area C. One estimate by a pro-Palestinian NGO says there are about 40,000 Arabs living there. We really don't know. At any rate, there's a Jewish majority in the areas that were taken over in 1967. So the time has come, therefore, to assert Israel's sovereignty over vital historic areas of the Jewish national homeland. Not only are they historic, but essentially they are required for the defense of the other parts of the state of Israel. On behalf of the Jewish people, past and future, and by virtue of historical claims in international law and civil and humanitarian rights, Israel is entitled to extend sovereignty over what's called Area C, and those areas of Jerusalem which have been settled since 1967. Settling in one's homeland is not considered occupation, it is a natural right. This land, as I said before, was conquered by many civilizations and empires, but its claim authentically is historic homeland only by the Jewish people. And in recognition of that uniqueness, lacking any authentic competing claims of sovereignty, then it would seem logical that Israeli law should be extended and sovereignty to those areas. This serves Israel's legitimate and strategic interests. So far, the areas taken in 1967 are not considered part of Israel, and essentially the rules there are a little bit different. It's controlled pretty much by the Israeli military. So claims of anybody other than the Jews that this is their homeland are motivated not by history but simply by politics, not by history, not by archaeology, or by nationality. The concept that the Palestinian Jews, for their claim to sovereignty, is defined by the absence of Jews, not the presence of Arabs. Their identity is ideological, which is the destruction of Israel, nothing less. And by the way, the Palestinian people themselves never existed. The Arabs living in the land of Israel for many years were either under foreign conquerors or under the Syrians or under the Jordanians. They never claimed a national identity. The Palestinian national identity came into being with the Palestinian Charter that was passed by the Palestinians with the support of the Arab government shortly before the Six-Day War. So if the Palestinian Arabs want national self-determination, they can go to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, which is carved out of the area of Palestine by the British in 1922. More than half of its population is Palestinian in Jordan. So they don't need another state, especially one ruled by those who seek Israel's destruction. I want to say a few more words about this, as I said, because we're on the right on the eve of the Jewish holiday of liberation. I'll say more when I come back.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In the previous segment of the program, I was speaking about the fact that we are approaching Passover, the holiday of freedom, and the freedom from Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. The Jews went to live in Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. They had some problems in the desert that are well described in the Bible, and it took them 40 years when it should have taken them less than 3 weeks. But that's another story. I want to get back to what I was saying about sovereignty. Since 1967, when the State of Israel has essentially returned to all the historical parts of the Holy Land, the time has come to essentially impose, if that's the right word, sovereignty on that area. Extending Israeli law and sovereignty to the area of Judea and Samaria essentially recognizes Jewish claims to the land, not as an occupier, but as a rightful inheritor, not as an oppressor, but to establish justice and the rule of law, not to deprive Arabs of their right to normalcy, but to ensure civil rights and humanitarian law to all the residents. Right now, by the way, if you go into some of the major communities in Judea and Samaria that have plants and producing things of various kinds of factories of all types, the overwhelming number of workers in these places are Arabs, local Arabs, who are earning a salary much higher than they could earn anywhere in the Arab areas. So they're quite happy about it. As a matter of fact, I have had occasion to visit several factories, and if you look around, you see the workers cannot even be disturbed from their work because they're making a good living. Many of them are getting paid, I assume, piecework, and therefore they won't even stop to talk to you. So that's a good thing. Extending Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria corrects the anachronistic governing administration, which is military, and that by annexing that area, it becomes civilian rule. This in itself is consistent with modern enlightened concepts of political authority and nationhood. Extending Israeli sovereignty affirms the historical truth that Israel's right to exist comes from millennia of Jewish civilization, from prophetic vision and prayer documented by authentic sources and acknowledged universally. Israeli sovereignty is not a matter of international approval, but rather of Jewish self-respect and self-determination. Protecting its citizens, which is the basic responsibility of a nation, requires extending Israeli sovereignty to Judea and Samaria. It is essential for Israel's security and well-being. It's the fundamental expression of Zionism, which is a renewal of Jewish life in the Jewish homeland. The return of the Jewish people to its homeland is a reaffirmation of God's presence in history and the purpose of the Jewish people to bring spiritual redemption to the world. And as we are approaching the holiday of freedom, that is something that we should keep in mind. It took 2,000 years from the destruction of the temple and the loss of Jewish sovereignty, and the Jews have held on. Other nations have come and gone. Other nations have risen and disappeared. Mighty empires have come and gone. You could take many examples, but the Jews have for 1,800 years prayed 3 times a day in the direction of Jerusalem, keeping alive the idea that the Jews should eventually come home to their natural homeland. And we have been able to do it, and it's something we should really celebrate on the holiday of freedom, which starts Saturday night. So it's not just a holiday that reflects something that happened in the Bible. It's a holiday that reflects not only Jewish history, but the renewal of Jewish sovereignty in our ancient homeland. No other nation can make that statement. This is the way it is, and thank God we are back where we started, and we can continue from this point on. And by the way, another aspect of the return to our natural homeland is that there are a really tremendous number of religious laws that have a difference whether you are living in the Jewish homeland, in the land of Israel, or outside. And the most prominent one that's going to hit everyone in the eye this coming week is the fact that the Passover holiday, which is 7 days long here in Israel, is 8 days long outside of Israel because of calendar restrictions and the fact that it took time for the people living outside of the land of Israel to get the word that the holiday was coming. So the rabbis instituted an extra day. So there's a tremendous number of differences between living in the land of Israel and living outside the land of Israel, as according to the Jewish law. And now that we returned after all these years, a lot of the laws that lay dormant for almost 2,000 years have now become active. And that's a good thing. It really and truly is. So that's the bottom line on the fact that Passover is coming up. We're back in our homeland, the holiday of freedom, and we celebrated historically the way we have been doing so for more than 3,000 years. And that gives one a sense of confidence in the future. If we got this far, and we got this far under all kind of conditions and duress, and not an easy one. The exile was really bad in many places. It culminated in the Holocaust when 6 million Jews were killed just because they were Jews. And now we have our own homeland again, our own sovereignty, our own ability to defend ourselves. That is a fantastic thing, and that's something we should remember now on our holiday of freedom. So it's not simply recalling old things that happened years ago, but it's recalling and living through the renewal of many of those old things. So that's what I wanted to say about the holiday. Now, having said that, and mentioned that we celebrate the renewal of Jewish sovereignty, I'd like to discuss a question a problem, an issue that has come about and reached the headlines because of the renewal of Jewish sovereignty. And that has to do with the questions of religion and state issues that we as an independent sovereign country, based on the Jewish religion and the fact that it is the religion that kept us alive outside of our homeland for almost 2,000 years, the question is, what place does religion have in a modern, essentially secular country? So returning to our homeland has eliminated a lot of problems, but it's also created or renewed a lot of problems. And one of them is the issue of religion and state. And I want to say a few words about that. I'll have to leave most of it for the next segment of the program because it's a big subject. Let me just start by saying that perhaps the biggest outstanding religion and state issue is the fact there is no civil marriage in Israel. Civil marriages performed outside of Israel are subsequently recognized and registered by the Interior Ministry. So religion essentially controls the rules of marriage here in Israel. And in other words, it's not just the Jewish religion, but the Christian and the Muslim, their religious authorities control the marriage and divorce rules. There are also some minor other little religions, but again, they're independent in their control of the basic laws of life, like marriage and like divorce. So that's something I want to say about during the next segment of the program, because it is a big issue that has many facets. I want to try to touch a number of them in order to make the listeners aware of one of the problems that came with Jewish sovereignty. Obviously, Jewish sovereignty is a good thing, but it, like anything, like all the good things in life, there's always problems involved. That's the way it is. So we live in an imperfect world, and you have a sovereignty based on a religious background, you have all kinds of new problems. I'll be back after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Since this Passover is the holiday of freedom, and the Jews got out of Egypt more than 3,000 years ago, and marched across the desert for 40 years till they came to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Now there are people making claims that this land is not ours. So I want to say something about an archaeological finding that took place several weeks ago. Archaeology in Israel is a popular movement. It's almost a national sport. It's not a passive spectator sport, but the thrilling active pastime of many thousands of people, like fishing is in the Canadian Lake Country or hunting is in the French Central Massif. A dramatic archaeological find hit the front page of the newspaper several weeks ago and squeezed into primetime television and radio news shows. While it has been a long time since one could honestly say they felt the same fervor for archaeology among the masses, the fact that the media did devote so much attention to these findings in a week dominated by political news indicates that the ember still burns the country's one great passion for excavations. 2 weeks ago, the Antiquities Authority announced a trove of finds from a wide-scale archaeological operation going on since 2017 in hidden caves in the Judean desert in cooperation with the Civil Administration's Archaeological Department. Among the finds were an ancient woven basket believed to be more than 10,000 years old and a 6,000-year-old skeleton of a child. These were not particularly Jewish finds, they were universal finds. Of more particular Jewish interest were the discovery of fragments of ancient scrolls of the biblical books of Zechariah and Nahum, as well as coins dating to the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 132 of the Common Era. And these findings come just a week after another archaeological story was highlighted in the media. An 11-year-old boy hiking with his family in the Negev desert discovered a figurine believed to be a fertility amulet dating to the First Temple period. The findings were announced from the Judean desert. They were not just stumbled upon then. The findings were announced just recently, but the artifacts were discovered actually over a year ago. Now, why is this important? Because they have apparently made a decision to announce these findings together, both those of a universal character and those particularly Jewish. So why is this significant? Because Israeli archaeologists have often been accused of focusing on finds that would validate Jewish claims to the land of Israel, at the expense of highlighting discoveries such as a 10,000-year-old basket and a 6,000-year-old skeleton do not have an Israeli angle. For the disquieted Israeli, the moral comforts of archaeology are considerable. In the political culture of Israel, the symbolic role of archaeology is immediately evident. Israeli archaeologists, professionals and amateurs, are not merely digging for knowledge and objects, but for the reassurance of our roots, which they find in the ancient Israelite remains scattered throughout the country. It is only natural that a people accused far and wide of being interlopers in a land not its own would find comfort in artifacts testifying to its presence in that same land going back more than 3,000 years. From Masada to the city of David to Tel Shiloh, whenever Israeli archaeologists make a startling discovery shedding light on biblical or Jewish history, they are accused of searching for and finding only Jewish artifacts in an attempt to whitewash the history of other peoples that historically roamed and resided in this land. But finding Jewish artifacts or even focusing on the discovery of Jewish archaeological sites does not deny the presence of other civilizations here. What those finds are able to do, however, is to refute the arguments of those who deny that Jews are among all the people who did roam and reside here, including in Jerusalem. For instance, it was Yasser Arafat who told U.S. President Bill Clinton at Camp David in 2000 that there was no temple on the Temple Mount, that it was rather in Nablus. In 2016, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, called UNESCO, passed a resolution that referred to the Temple Mount exclusively by its Arabic name, Haram al-Sharif, thereby erasing any Jewish link to the site of Jerusalem. By unveiling both Jewish and general archaeological discoveries on the same day, Israel made a statement: "We are interested and focused on both Jewish and general discoveries." But as significant as the discovery of the woven basket and the mummified skeleton were, for most Israeli Jews, and particularly Jewish findings, likely resonated more loudly. The bones of early men can be found in the plains of Tanzania. Ancient woven baskets can be located in the pyramids of Peru. But only in Israel do you find a Greek translation of Zechariah with the word God written in ancient Hebrew, and only in Israel will you find coins minted that commemorate the last great stab at Jewish independence. And what was one of the biblical fragments discovered and reconstructed? It was a verse from Zechariah, chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, eerily relevant as we had an election this year. It says in this thing that they found, and I quote, "These are the things you are to do. Speak the truth to one another, render true and perfect justice in your gates. Do not contrive evil against one another. Do not love perjury, because all those things that are things that I hate, declares the Lord." That is from the book of Zechariah, or Zechariah in English. So giving voice to the feelings of many who were excited and even moved by the findings, the head of the Antiquities Surveys Department said in an interview on Israeli television that within hand's reach is a fragment that a Jew, one of your forefathers, read from. Calling this the apex, the interviewer said that after 1,900 years of horrible exile, artifacts such as those found in the Judean desert are the closest we can come to our forefathers. So here we are celebrating Passover when our forefathers left Egypt. It took them 40 years to get to the Holy Land, but once they were there, they made it their home. And it was their home during the first temple period, the home during the second temple period, and then unfortunately we were kicked out roughly in the year 70. And therefore the holiday of Passover, in a sense, is really supported and supplemented by the archaeological finds. And it's interesting, by the way, that the people who did this, the archaeological people of the Civil Administration's Archaeological Department, were very open about what they found. They found things, as I said, an ancient skeleton, a 6,000-year-old skeleton, and a basket more than 10,000 years old that were not particularly related to Jewish history. So our archaeological people are honest. You find something, you report it. But they also found a lot of things that are linked to Jewish life here. And this is tremendously important particularly there are those who argue against the legitimacy of our being here. So here we are on the eve of the holiday of freedom when we left Egypt, and we have a Seder, a ritual on the first night of Passover, in which we say, the Lord was good to us then, and the Lord is good to us now. He promised things to us then, and he kept his promise. And here we are, after 2,000 years of exile, back into the land that we can prove that is really ours, simply by digging below the surface and finding articles. Nobody can argue with these things. These things are real. And they are a testimony that this indeed is our land. And it was our ancient land. It is our modern land. And this is what we celebrate on Passover, on Pesach. Not just the exile from and being in Egypt, but the fact that we came home to our land, which was ours then, and it is ours now. And we have proof of this. So having said all that, I wish the listeners the best for the holiday of Passover, good health to everybody, and may we all live to be well and get it out of what we're suffering now with the coronavirus, and then have some real freedom again. So that is my wishes to all the listeners. Take care of yourselves until next time. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.